Hi guys. I hope everybody's still doing okay. I'm going to jump into what I want to talk about really quick because I have a lot, and you guys know this screen recorder that I'm using will only let me talk for 15 minutes. So I need to just jump into what I've got planned. So I'm going to move myself off the front of the screen and head into this PowerPoint that I made for you guys. So again, we don't hardly ever use PowerPoints in our class, I don't think, honestly, but it's been helping me to kind of be focused on what I wanted to talk about with you guys in a short amount of time, so bear with the PowerPoint kind of format here. All right, so there's a couple of main things that I wanted you guys to make sure that you understood before you leave this class. Now, we've talked about the Southern Gothic movement with Flannery O'Connor. We talked about like there's just this a trend in literature, especially the Gothic literature would have started, like this says, in 1764 with the novel The Castle of Otranto, which is a novel I really recommend you reading. Even though it's old, it's still really fun. It's pretty short, but it's one of the first horror stories, I think you could say, that we have like in literature, and it's a British novel. So what we're reading is coming out of that tradition, and as you can see here, it's a combination of the horror and death and sometimes romance, which probably it can refer to like romance, like Romeo and Juliet romance, but then also like the romantic big R that I'm about to talk about in a second, another literary movement. But in any case, this type of fiction, it tended to place emphasis on emotion and a pleasurable kind of terror, which is a strange thing to think about, right? Like, if you think about, we haven't really talked about this very much in our class, unfortunately, but the idea about people wanting to be scared, like going to watch horror movies for fun, is very common for us. But these kinds of literature, especially that Poe was interested in, we're curious about why our psyche is kind of invigorated by horror. Why are we drawn to that? Why is there pleasure with horror? So that's kind of this is a very quick analysis of a very big topic, but that hopefully gets some of it across. I'm about to do that again with the romantics. I'm going to make sure that you can see my whole slide here. Oh no, it went to the next one. Sorry, y'all. 1 second. I want to make sure this shows. Okay. So the romantic period of literature, I'm about to say like something super quick again for something large, but it's a movement in literature. Remember we talked maybe a little bit about the road about how it's contemporary or postmodern. We have these big movements in literature, like The Witch and Anne Bradstreet and Mary Rowlandson. All of that kind of stuff would be considered like post-colonial. It's a movement in literature, so those kinds of movements are important to know, not necessarily like for the class, but just in life. Like, it's the same with art. You'll have like modernism, which we also have in literature. So romanticism is one of those big names, and it's related to art too, but it's emphasized by emphasis on emotion and individualism and this glorification of nature. Oh my gosh, if you read some Emerson, you'll see some of that. It emphasizes an intense emotion. It's interested in beauty, but it's also interested in like the horror and awe of nature at the same time. Read Frankenstein to get more of this, which is British, so we're not reading it in this class, but tangential, or actually like one of the most important texts to romantic literature is Frankenstein. So look for that. Now, let's jump into talking about Bernice, which I think is harder to understand of the two stories that you guys read today, even though it's a bit shorter. I have my actual like Poe anthology. I took a class in graduate school that was just about Edgar Allan Poe, so that's all we read all semester, and it was actually in the summer, so it was honestly my favorite class that I had in grad school, but I got this book for it. Anyway, let's talk about Bernice, which there are a lot of Poe short stories, and what I decided to do for this class and trying to pick the ones that I wanted you to read, I decided to pick the ones that I thought were kind of the scariest or the most, I don't know, grotesque. So I wanted to give us, I don't know, the weirdest stuff. Y'all know that's usually what I'm drawn to, is the weird stuff. All right, so Bernice, I'll go over like a quick summary of it in case you couldn't understand like what was going on, and you could do this yourself just by like Googling a summary. It's okay to do that, especially when something's as hard as this to read. But what happens in this is we have this narrator. He has this weird mental problem where he gets like fixated on stuff, like can't stop paying attention to, like, there's an ink blot in a book that he's obsessed with at one point, and he calls it monomania. I don't know if it's the same as what we would call OCD, maybe some like similar kind of experience, but he is obsessive at the very least, and he gets obsessed with one thing. And what he gets obsessed with in this story is his cousin/wife's teeth. So what happens is, we don't know why, but she starts to degenerate and die. For me, like, you're like, wait, did she die? Yeah, she dies. She gets buried. Something happens to her and she dies. Well, the narrator, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he's sitting at home and he's thinking about, like, okay, well, what am I remembering from her? And it's her teeth. He's obsessed still with her teeth. That's his, like, mono focus, which is strange. And then the next thing he knows, his servant comes in and says, you know what? Someone dug up a body, Bernice. It was alive. And he's like, what? How did that happen? Well, then he realizes he's covered in mud. And he's the one who's dug up her body. And not only did he dig up her body, which is alive now, he took all her teeth. So it's the weirdest story. And everyone's like, why in the world did he take her teeth? Like, why is he obsessed with this? Like, why does he dig her up? Why doesn't he remember that he did it? Why isn't that part of the story, right? He starts thinking about it, her death and her teeth, and then all of a sudden he wakes up. So he doesn't even narrate himself digging her up or pulling out the teeth. He's forgotten that he did it. So what is worth noting, I think, in terms of, like, what's horrifying about this story, is that what is horrifying to the narrator is his own mind and what he can't remember. So this is a quote. He says, "But of that dreary period which intervened, I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension. Yet its memory was replete with horror from being vague, and terror more terrible from ambiguity." It's the vague and the ambiguity that frustrate him and horrify him. The fact that he doesn't know why he's obsessed with her teeth, and the fact that he doesn't remember getting them, is what's horrifying. So if we've talked about, like, the horror of God with the Puritans, and we talked about with the Road, horror of other people, like, that's terrifying what other people can do to us, right? Like eat us, for instance. Other versions too, like the horrors of slavery, which would be like horrors of people again. This one's different because it's like horror of your own brain and your own capability to forget and to have mental illness, and it could be confusing. So what Poe, and that's like the main point I would want you to get from Bernice, is that what's horrifying in this text, if you boiled it down, is the capability of us to not understand our own mind and to do things that don't even make sense to us. So if you are like, well, what do the teeth mean? I personally, there's lots of interpretations of this. I think they mean nothing. I think that they mean the absurd, or what the things that we think of that make no sense. Have you ever had like a weird dream? And teeth is one of those dreams. Like, you dream your teeth fall out. I dream this all the time. And it's a popular dream. You can Google this, and it's all Freudian and whatever else. But like, it doesn't really make sense why I have that dream. It doesn't really make sense why he's obsessed with the teeth necessarily. It's just something our brain does that we can't understand, and that's kind of horrifying. So that's one of those things, is like the relationship to the self that is inexplicable often, especially if there's a mental illness going on, that Poe is trying to get at here. Like, what's terrifying is our own mind. He does this again with the black cat. The black cat, like I said, I think is a little easier to understand, but I'll still do a quick summary. What happens is there's this guy who likes animals, so he has this cat. Well, he all of a sudden one day takes the cat's eye out, and then he kills the cat. And it's like, what? Why did you do this? Okay, moving forward, he gets another cat, which you already are knowing, like, oh no, this is probably not going to end well for the second cat. Well, he does. He goes to kill the second cat, but as his wife stops him, he kills his wife instead. So you're like, wait a minute. He's killed a cat. He's killed his wife. He buries his wife in, like, the chimney or the wall of some sort, and he goes to look for the second black cat to go kill it too. Well, he can't find it. Turns out he had buried the second cat with the dead wife, and when the police come, the cat is, like, meowing, and it gets him, like, they find his wife's body because the second cat reveals it to him. Very weird. Oh, also worth noting, this guy's an alcoholic. So we had a character in the first story who's just got, like, some mental obsessive something, and then we have another character who is who is messing with his own mind through alcohol. And that's not even talking about like drugs here. We're just talking literally like alcohol and how it shifts the way that we think and the things that we do. So he's interested again in the ways that the mind can be manipulated through substance or just in and of itself. So I have a couple of quotes here. I'm so mad that my screen, I have to like move this. It only lets me record so much of my screen. But there we go. These are two quotes that I pulled from the Black Cat. He says, "I knew myself no longer," when he's talking about after having alcohol. This is toward the very beginning of the story. "I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body." So he's talking about, I don't even know who I am when I drink. And it's a comment on, again, the horror of the self and how we can lose control of our own senses and our own, like, not just senses like touch, smell, whatever, but like our sensibility, like how that can be manipulated. And then not only that, it's a horror of, like, okay, so this quote, he says, "Perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart. Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not?" So he's saying, like, we do bad things just because they're bad, is the perspective here. That if you're like, well, why did he kill the cat? Just because he did. Don't you want to kill a cat? Is kind of the point here. And it kind of almost goes back to like this idea of sin nature. If you know about like particularly Christianity, there's this idea that humans are just naturally born into sin. Eve ate that apple and we've been doomed ever since. I'm not necessarily saying that this is a Christian perspective though, because for Poe, for Christians, that sin nature needs to be remedied by being saved and, you know, fulfilling whatever God wants you to do in life. But for Poe, he's like, we're bad and it's kind of cool in his point of view. Like, it takes us away, like that unsensibleness is interesting. Like, he's compelled by the darkness. He's not necessarily like trying to be redeemed from it. He's trying to maybe understand it a little better, but it's not like he's trying to make it go away. He's just saying, like, this is human nature. We just do crazy things to each other, or to cats in this case. So yeah, again, main thing to take away from both of these stories, I think, and in different sorts of ways, is that there's this fear of the self, the horrifying, and the mind. Oh gosh, we should have talked about that with Emily Dickinson too, because she was also trapped in her mind. Remember, we talked about how she was obsessed with death, and she was scared to leave, but she was also interested in what is like going on in her own mind. That's part of this here too, I would say, is that there's this sort of like obsession with the self and how what we are all capable of being destructive and whatnot. So I hope that my quick overview here helps you some. I know these are harder than The Road, perhaps. They're older, so if you are still struggling, I don't mind it at all if you read some stuff online, but do please like write your discussion post honestly and don't take anything offline that you've read. But if you need like to look at the Wikipedia page for more summary or something like that, that's fine. I understand. It helps to look around to see what other people are saying a little bit and then really focus in on your own analysis for the discussion. The discussion post is going to be exactly the same format as the one with The Road. The quiz is the same, so if you've listened to this first, might help with a quiz, I don't know. It's fine with me either way. But I do hope you read this, and I hope that you get some kind of understanding and that you can manage your way through the work